Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. Episode 16, Easter Holiday Special 2024.
Welcome back, everybody, to our Easter special, the obligatory Easter special from Emma and Tom Talk Teaching.
Compulsory Easter special.
Compulsory, absolutely, which means that we've had to do our homework this time in abundance. We've each got 3 things. I think it started out as blogs, tweets and stories, but I think we've strayed from the brief, haven't we, a little bit?
Strayed in a lot of things, yes. And I've not done my homework because if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see we're not in our studio because I forgot to book it.
You are forgiven, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Well, you're certainly forgiven by me. So we are flying fast and loose. We're not frying fast and loose. We might feel like we're frying right now in the middle of a busy term. But who's going to go first, Tom? Do you want me to kick us off?
Yes, you're welcome to kick us off. So 3 random things we've pulled off the internet to entertain one another and our audience with. So yeah, if you've got something you'd like to bring.
I do. So I've pulled together 3 things that have sort of been coming in and out of my consciousness for the last few months. And the first one relates to curriculum design and subject disciplines. Because for those of you who don't know or would like a refresher, we are in the middle of curriculum reform and implementation here in Wales. And we've got a very high-level subsidiarity model of curriculum design, such that teachers in the field are curriculum designers. And I stumbled across a nice resource written by Cambridge Assessment International Education Teaching and Learning Team called Getting Started with Key Concepts. And I've just pulled out a chunk of it. There's quite a lot to it, and it's got some really handy video explanations from somebody called Dr. Liz Taylor, who's a geography specialist in curriculum pedagogy and teacher development. But so it's worth looking at it in its entirety. But I wanted to home in on the idea of substantive and second order concepts, as well as something that we've actually covered with guests on our podcast already called threshold concepts. So I'm going to look at those 3 things. So I'm going to just start reading from the resource now, and hopefully it'll start to get the ideas flowing in your heads as it did for me when I did with regard to drama. So there are various approaches to thinking about types of concepts. Using substantive, second order and threshold concepts is particularly helpful to inform high quality planning for progression. So substantive and second order concepts, we'll deal with those first. So the division between substantive and second order concepts stems from a source entitled Science, Curriculum and Liberal Education, which is a selection of essays on the structure of disciplines by Joseph Schwab, 1978. So quite a dated source now, but Joseph Schwab is somebody who I think Dr. Kev has referred to on this podcast, but it's also somebody who Lee Schulman, who I'm quite interested in, who coined the idea and theory of pedagogical content knowledge. He draws a lot from Schwab's work. So he puts forward this idea of substantive and second order concepts. So in this approach, there are 2 sets of concepts. So starting with substantive concepts, these are part of the substance or content knowledge in a subject. For example, in geography, these might include river, trade, city, or ecosystem. And then you've got second order concepts, and these shape the key questions asked in a subject and organise the subject knowledge. And the source gives the example of second order concepts for history, which might include cause and consequence or causation, change and continuity, similarity and difference, historical significance. And the source says that there will be an overlap of substantive concepts between subjects, which is really interesting to those of us out there working on curriculum for Wales who are looking for those sort of meaningful links or powerful opportunities for making links between subjects. So a student might learn about renewable energy in science, geography, economics and politics. So they've got that common substantive concepts between subject disciplines there. There may even be overlap of second order concepts, for example, change in both history and geography. And it is the particular combination of substantive and second order concepts that makes each discipline distinct and unique. And I think the important thing to note about the difference between the two is that without the second order concepts, you've just got a mass of these sort of floating substantive concepts that aren't sort of brought together in an organised order. In order for you to sort of then make sense of how you might teach the discipline. So when you think about cause and consequence, there will be a body of substantive concepts that sit beneath and feed into that second order concept. And cause and consequence, you could imagine being a second order concept that pupils return to when looking at various different sort of historical dynasties, let's say, for instance, or wars. So then it goes on to say content, and they're quoting from Young here, Young 2015. Content, therefore, is important, not as facts to be memorised, but because without it, students cannot acquire concepts and therefore will not develop their understanding and progress in their learning. So they're making a kind of strong argument here for understanding and identification of substantive and second order concepts as being a means of planning a progressive curriculum model. And then we come to threshold concepts. And some of you, this might be a refresher from our previous episode. So a threshold concept is one that, once understood, modifies learners' understanding of a particular field and helps them to make progress. It helps them to go through a doorway into a new way of understanding a topic or subject. The idea comes from a research project on teaching and learning in undergraduate courses by Mayer and Land, 2003. While core concepts build on existing learning layer by layer, threshold concepts open up a new way of thinking. And to quote from Mayer and Land, they say, there may thus be a transformed internal view of subject matter, subject landscape, or even worldview. A threshold concept is likely to be difficult for a learner to grasp, but once they understand it, their learning can move to a new level within the discipline. It can be hard for a learner to make progress if they don't understand key threshold concepts. And they go on to say that there is debate over which concepts might be identified as threshold in a particular discipline. The original work in this area was in economics, but researchers in engineering, computing, geography and healthcare, and we know physical education, have also become interested in this idea. For example, suggested threshold concepts include sustainability for geography, complex number for mathematics, and opportunity cost for economics. And so then I scrolled to the bottom of this really interesting, it's kind of like a blog post really, but it's more substantial than that. They invite the readers to consider some questions. So in reflecting back over your own learning of your subject, and I'm really trying to think about this deeply with regards to drama, and if there's anybody out there who's a drama teacher who wants to get in that pain cave with me, then feel free to get in touch. They say, ask yourself, can you suggest one or more threshold concepts in your discipline? What changed your perspective and modified your view of an issue or field when you were learning that particular subject discipline? And then they invite you to read about your discipline. To what extent is there agreement in key concepts within the academic and teaching communities for your discipline? Can you see how there might be a difference between substantive and second order concepts for your discipline? And again, I've been sort of Googling various permutations of second order concepts in drama, and I can't find any yet, but if anybody knows of any out there that people have put forward, please get in touch. And then finally, is there any discussion of this in the professional literature you have access to? So, all of our subject disciplines will have, learning to teach X subject or debates in X subject. And you might find that in there are chapters pertaining to key concepts within the discipline. They might even use Schwab's categories and also threshold concepts to consider them. So have a look at what's out there. Discuss it if you're not already. I'm sure people are already doing this in Wales, but it just helps to have sort of a name for these different types of concepts so we can start to begin to think about how they apply to our disciplines.
Yeah, I think it really does help. And as you were describing those, I was thinking, wow, how useful those are for our colleagues out in Wales who are trying to come to grips with a curriculum framework, which really does leave us mainly floating around at very high altitude, saying some very, very big things about subject disciplines and groups of disciplines. And I just sort of find myself wondering why there wasn't some attempt to kind of embed some of these things in the advice about designing curriculums and things like that, because it's lovely to do it when you get the chance to do it. I mean, we know we have a great time with our students doing it, and our students have come and talked about it on the podcast. It's great to have that time and space, but actually, even here where we're not teaching 20 odd lessons a week, it's taken us a long time to come up with a process by which our student teachers can first of all get a clear sense of what their own subject is, and then to be able to discuss it with other people, and then to start comparing notes. It's been a long, difficult road for us, and it's kind of our job to do it, and we've had the time to do it. I just wonder why our school colleagues are to a large extent being left to kind of work this stuff out for themselves, because that would just be a wonderful thing to spend time doing.
I think it would. And I do wonder, because I just think back to my own teacher education, and I certainly had experience learning how to teach individual lessons, even medium-term plans. But curriculum design was not something that was covered, different models of curriculum design, approaches to curriculum design. And this is, not to speak ill of the excellent route into teacher education, into teaching that I embarked upon. But it simply wasn't part of my teacher education curriculum at that time. And I wonder if there would be a lot of other teachers out there that trained around about that time, or maybe less recently. And I wonder how much curriculum design is going to find its way into. It's certainly something we're thinking about quite a lot here at Cardiff Met. But as you say, not necessarily enough professional learning out there at the point at which it was needed the most.
No, and I mean, I'd even go further than that, and even step back from curriculum design, and that thing I just mentioned there about, well, what is your subject? What is it for? What is it not? What is it about? What is it trying to achieve? I mean, we certainly didn't really do that to a huge extent. I mean, yes, you look at the kind of basic building blocks of the subject, but to really dig into your subject and work out what it is such that you can explain it to another person, I think is the first step before you can even do that. We love doing it. We love talking about our subjects, but we've had to realise that that's a conscious process you have to go through before you can do any of that stuff. And I just wonder where the space is for teachers to be able to do that in school.
Well, if you do create a pocket of space, you've got three things to consider there. And I'm sure, as I said a moment, I know for a fact that some schools are doing this, but particularly for my subject discipline, I won't go on too much about this. It is quite a challenging question when you come to discuss key concepts in drama, because it gets to the heart of how you perceive of drama, whether you perceive of it as a method, as a process, or whether you perceive of it as theatre, the art form. And depending on which side of that fence that you sit, or whether you indeed perceive of it as being a hybrid of both of those things, that's going to influence what you consider and outline as being substantive and second order concepts.
And I think also, just hopping on the back of that, just because subjects have been placed in areas of learning and experience doesn't mean that they necessarily dovetail beautifully with one another. I mean, the work we've done with the expressive arts, the subjects are actually really different.
Yes, yeah. And coming to that conclusion via this sort of work is is great
Yeah.
and is what we want.
Oh, yeah, it's fun. It's great. It's fun. It just takes time, doesn't it?
It does.
You do wonder to what extent people have got that time. Oh, well.
So, over to you,
So
Tom.
over to
What's your
me.
first offering?
Well, I think it sort of links to what you've been talking about, although it is absolutely nothing to do with curriculum for Wales. You might be relieved to hear. But it is to do with Wales. So this is one perhaps for our international listeners who might like to know a little bit more about Wales. Perhaps they have a view about Wales, which it might challenge or it might complement, I don't know. And also for our local listeners, our Welsh listeners, because obviously curriculum for Wales is very much situated in place, and so it's important to think about the place of Wales. I'm coming at it from a musical angle, and it will culminate in a book recommendation, not a particularly academic book, although it is written by an academic, but it is a book you can read for fun. And we're going to consider Wales, the land of song.
Oh,
Wales is known as the land of song, isn't it?
it is.
And I suppose it's interesting to ask ourselves, since when has Wales been known as the land of song? I mean, all right, bit of participation. Any thoughts?
Oh,
You know a bit more because you've heard me going on about this, but
I remember reading the introduction to your PhD thesis, and I feel like it probably goes back a lot further, but I'm thinking mining communities.
you would be right, yeah. I mean, there's a bit of a myth around Wales, isn't there, that there's this sort of ancient culture steeped in the arts and, poetry, and it all goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and, people have been roaming around Wales singing hymns since kind of the time of antiquity. And actually, it is a little bit of a myth, because a lot of this stuff around, I mean, the land of song, people have been trying to trace the first use of that. And actually, it only goes back to about 1870. I found two references to it. One is in the London Illustrated News in 1873, and one is a famous conductor who's said to have said it in 1877. But either way, it's not a really, really long time ago.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it comes down to the fact that coal, the discovery of coal, the South Wales coalfield, powered the Industrial Revolution. And I'm looking at a chapter here by Gareth Williams, who I believe has been an academic in Aberystwyth and also at the University of Glamorgan, which is now known as University of South Wales. And he writes about music in Wales in the time of the Industrial Revolution. And he makes the point that the population of Wales doubled in 50 years during the 19th century, and then doubled again in the next 50 years. So the population of Wales absolutely exploded with immigration into Wales from all over the place, people looking for jobs, which was linked to coal. He says that the area of the sort of Bristol Channel, South Wales and all the coal kind of leaving by sea, was as economically significant as the Persian Gulf is today.
Wow.
Yeah, so that gives you a sense of the fact that Wales, which had previously been very, very rural, kind of grew into this massive economic powerhouse. And actually, if you are around here, if you go down to Cardiff Bay where the ships used to set sail, the buildings are absolutely stunning. They're kind of a bit like sort of central City of London old kind of buildings.
I'm thinking about the coal exchange, that beautiful building.
Yeah, amazing amounts of money. And with money came lots and lots of people who lived in the valleys and in Cardiff, did these, horrendously difficult jobs. And with it came this bizarre explosion of choral singing, which is what kind of Wales is known for. But the point is that it's only really been 150 years. It's not a kind of hundreds and hundreds of year old thing. It's all about all these, like these Welsh lady costumes, that your kids get dressed up in for St. David's Day. There are a lot of it is kind of the invention of wealthy English Victorian people. It's all a bit of a made up kind of job. But they're
going to come after you.
Oh, they're going to come after me, yeah. But I'm reading this chapter by Gareth Williams called Fighting Choirs. And so I thought I would just give a little bit of a sense of the fact that these choirs of Welsh manual workers were really quite an interesting bunch. I mean, they're very famous for having banded together in the 1870s into a choir of 450 people. They went to London and they won this enormous, ornate, gold and jewelled cup, which now sits in St Fagans, a museum of Welsh life here near Cardiff. But it was won by the conductor Griffith Rhys-Jones, known as Caradog, whose statue stands in the centre of Aberdare, if you're in those parts. If you go to Aberdare, you will see an enormous statue of a man with a conductor's baton and his arms raised up. He was Caradog. He was the man who is supposed to have said that Wales was the land of song. But these were working class and mostly illiterate people who were singing these choral pieces. And Gareth Williams makes some interesting points about these. First of all, the fact that there were working class women singing in these choirs, which was interesting. You know, they were getting out and about. They were mixing with men. They were singing. They were getting dressed up very nicely. He says, in fact, in one particular competition, because they were very competitive, the sopranos had blue sashes around their waists and the contraltos red ones. Another choir's female members wore white dresses and pink sashes from shoulder to waist, and the altos wore the same with blue sashes, and all were under sailor hats. And get this bit, the adjudicator was forgiven for ostentatiously turning his back on them as they formed up, for no one could pay attention to the music with eyes on that dream of dressed bliss on the platform. He goes on to say, the sexist male gaze offends our modern sensibilities, but we dismiss at our peril the self-esteem provided by such sartorial displays. And the other thing I just wanted to draw people's attention to, if they are thinking about this kind of very interesting scene which was happening in the last 150 years, which was literally illiterate working class Welsh manual workers singing the music of J.S. Bach and Handel, you know, great composers from Europe, in these competitions. I mean, it's very tempting to romanticize it. However, they were actually quite violent, these choirs. And there are stories of the female members, again, particularly prominent in barracking the adjudicators in a way which even abashed their male companions. One reporter compared them to quite an army of Amazons whose bad language led them to be expelled from the Eisteddfod, and even at the train station they continued to behave in an unseemly manner.
They sound great.
They do sound quite great, don't they? And there's an English composer, Samuel Coleridge Taylor. This will be my last quote from this. He said in a conversation with another adjudicator, this adjudicator said, "You have no idea what adjudicating in that place is like. Why, I had my hat knocked in and only got safely away with great difficulty." But then he wrote to an American agent, Coleridge Taylor, "Please don't make any arrangements to wrap me in cotton wool. I do a great deal of adjudicating in Wales." Among a very rough class of people where most adjudicators have eggs and boots thrown at them.
Oh, that is brilliant.
So it's quite an interesting scene. It's well worth reading up about if you want to know a little bit about the cultural heritage of Wales, because one of the points I made in my doctorate was the fact that even when the curriculum was coming from Westminster pre-devolution in 1999, Wales actually opted out of the music one and had their own. And a lot of the other culturally significant ones, they opted out and had their own. And so it's kind of quite important to know the place. And if you want a good book about this, Gareth Williams published a book back in about 2000 called Valleys of Song, in which he tells the story of these fighting choirs and their kind of crazy conductors and all the mad things that they did and the places they travelled to go and compete and chuck their boots and their eggs. So Valleys of Song by Gareth Williams might give you an insight into that, not quite the musical past that you thought it was.
Yeah, you've sort of burst the romantic bubble a bit there, haven't you? Or Gareth Williams certainly has.
Yeah, but it's very interesting, isn't it, that they were there and they were living in these awful conditions. I mean, you get a sense of it from, if you look at the houses, you know, in the middle of Cardiff and up in the valleys, you know, they were thrown up in a space of about 50 years. You know, they're not greatly brilliantly built. I mean, I've lived in a few of them myself, and then they are falling to bits a little bit. And they were very, very small, and there were lots of people in them, and you know, the life expectancy was really low. And that they went and they did this for their recreation is kind of interesting and kind of unique, I think.
Yeah, and real escapism through the arts, and probably got them sort of hearing and singing and understanding, I don't know, music that they otherwise might never have encountered.
Yeah, definitely. And they really sort of caught the imagination of the English when they did sort of travel to compete. You know, the Times would write about, you know, in amazement about these rough Welsh blokes. In fact, they say, here we go, they say, when it's remembered this chorus is almost entirely drawn from the labouring classes, we cannot but wonder at the excellence they've attained, an excellence unattainable except through assiduous and continued study. Very impressive.
Very
even if
impressive.
They were quite rude and rough.
I quite like that about them. Okay, so I stuck with the blogs, tweets and stories format. So I've got I've got a tweet next, but it did lead me to a blog, so I've cheated a little bit. So Professor Rachel Lofthouse, you might be familiar with, Tom.
Yes,
do you recognise that name?
I do.
So she's a professor of teacher education at Leeds Beckett University and does various other bits and bobs. She's quite active on Twitter. And back in November, I spotted a tweet. She was actually retweeting someone called Warwick Mansell, who I think you might have...
Yes, Warwick Mansell. I have brought Warwick Mansell to the podcast
I'm sure
before.
you have.
Yeah.
He's an education journalist.
Oh, yes. He's got a great website. Yes. Education Matters.
That's it. Yeah, that's the one. I think
Yes,
something like that. And he's a long-time Guardian contributor. The NEU have a blog. He contributes to that. So Rachel Lofthouse was retweeting him because he was sort of exposing some pedagogical sort of practices that were being endorsed and sort of centrally controlled by a multi-academy trust. And Rachel Lofthouse retweeted his tweet with her own words saying, "This is why I wrote this blog on the pedagogy of professional decline. Don't sit back and let it happen." And then she's got a link to her blog. So I'm just going to do a very, very quick overview of her blog and just pull out some bits. So she says, and this is actually from the 27th of September that she wrote this, taking a stand against the pedagogy of professional decline. "Last week, I coined a new phrase, the pedagogy of professional decline. That day, I tweeted it and used the following description. It describes both classroom practices and continuing professional development which reduce agency, neglect expertise, drive conformity, narrow opportunities, damage relationships. It is the opposite of helping learners flourish." Strong words. This week, I saw a new Twitter thread written by Warwick Mansell and felt compelled to use the phrase again in response to his account of what teachers at a multi-academy trust have been directed to do. He reported that the teachers have been told to remove all furniture, artwork and even rubbish bins from the front of their classrooms, display a large branded multi-academy trust poster in every classroom, and to read to students up to year 11 with a set of instructions which script the words that a teacher must use and regulate that students will follow the lines of the text with their rulers. So they've got these regulations of how a lesson is going to play out, and these actions are couched in the alluring conditions of reducing students' cognitive load. Mm-hmm. They also seem to me designed in line with a creeping narrative that we must also reduce teachers' cognitive load. And then she goes on to sort of say why she's coining that term of the pedagogy of professional decline. She says things like, we need a language which helps us to label what we experience directly and notice around us, which I suppose she's seeing. And I recognise some of what she's describing, not only in England, but across the border here in Wales too. We need an organising concept which can be used as a frame to help us recognise patterns and trends in what might seem unconnected developments in education. We need to recognise the inherent relationship between the pedagogies that we deploy in classrooms, the limits that these might place on teachers' accepted repertoire, and the restricted opportunities that might result for teacher reflection and professional development. And that's just, she goes on to say a few extra bits and bobs, but I urge you to have a look at that blog post in full.
Interesting. I mean, and I should apologise to to Warwick Mansell, by the way. It's Education Uncovered. Education Matters is our friend Gareth, isn't it?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Welsh Education
Gareth
Matters.
Evans.
Gareth Evans. No, Warwick Mansell is educationuncovered.co.uk, and an excellent news site it is too. Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because there are times when the sort of pre-packaged or the consistent can be really useful. I mean, we've heard really compelling testimony from Gareth Rain about that, about the fact that some of the time lessons are scripted and there's a reason for that, and they've kind of been through the kind of justification for that and all of that. You don't always want crazy mavericks around every corner doing everything differently just to kind of be difficult. But on the other hand, you've got to have your eye out sometimes for some of this stuff, because often there's an ideological thing hiding underneath it. And I think it's all the more important, as we were saying, weren't we, in the car on the way up to this recording? We were saying it's all the more important when you're in the middle of a recruitment crisis and you are staring down the barrel potentially of having quite a lot of unqualified teachers floating around in your classrooms. If you're not very careful, it can become tempting to really go a long way down that road, and not for the right reasons.
Yes. Yes, absolutely agreed. The other thing that I am quite worried about is the erosion of distinctive pedagogies associated with subject disciplines, and what that sort of, mandatory approach to pedagogy. I remember something that David Egan said on a podcast earlier on, I think maybe it was last season, about, pedagogy being paramount. And in one sense, it's difficult to argue that, but it's not all pedagogy is the same.
Yeah, there's not one pedagogy for all things, is there? I'm sure that's not what he was saying.
No, it wasn't. And in fact, he was coming at it as a historian as well. And he was making the point that, he's very, very much sort of, a subject specialist. And I know that he wouldn't want to lose that. But I do worry about the erosion of subject-specific pedagogies in the wake of the pedagogy of professional decline.
Yeah, because Gareth Rain was talking about it being used. I think it was specifically some kind of literacy intervention, wasn't it, where it was all scripted. And I mean, fine if there's kind of research behind it and you've really looked into it and interrogated it and critiqued it and it works, great, go for it. I suppose the danger isn't it, that there's always going to be a person, a centralising person, what you might slightly pejoratively call a kind of desk jockey type person, who's going to see that and think, we'll roll that out into all subjects. And that's when you start really running into trouble.
Yes, I agree with you. So that point that Rachel Lofthouse makes about, there's a lot of professional discernment that goes into selecting pedagogical approaches, and having studied pedagogical content knowledge, that process is complex, and it sort of deprofessionalises teachers by suggesting that they can do it via a roadmap, that sits at the front of the class.
Yeah, it goes back to that point you were making about curriculum design, actually, and it's something else we've talked about, isn't it, which is that if the areas of learning and experience allow you to, for example, mash together music, drama and art into a single lesson experience, you might end up doing that not because you think it's the best way to do music, drama and art. And if you think it is, and you've got a good argument, then absolutely knock yourself out. But you might be doing it because in the middle of a recruitment crisis, you didn't manage to find a specialist music teacher and you're asking your drama teacher to just bung a bit of music in there. Nobody thinks that's what they want to be doing in that situation, but you're forced into it. And similarly with something like this sort of scripted, pre-packaged stuff, if, as we saw in a early stage report from David Egan the other day, there are head teachers out there who've now given up putting job ads out for certain positions because they've given up trying to get them filled, then these things are going to start getting used not for the right reasons.
Yeah. I agree. And I also have a view down the line, of what will happen to this generation of learners that have come through a multi-academy trust who believe that learning happens in a particular way. who hopefully find themselves, in whatever future learning context that might be. It might be in the context of an apprenticeship, it might be in the context of a university, where learning and teaching happens very differently. And, how will they find that experience? How will they thrive through that experience? Pedagogy is so varied. If they've only ever had one sort of restricted diet of teaching and learning, I wonder what that will do for them as future learners.
Yes, it's a good question. Moving on to my next one, it may not be a problem that we're going to have for reasons that will become clear in a moment.
Okay.
I was, as is my wont, noodling about, reading things. I have a bit of a strand called social media will bring about the end of the world in these. Well, I've now found something else that's going to bring about the end of the world potentially. This is a massive article. It's a preprint. So in other words, it's not a sort of complete published article. It's a sort of preview, a sort of in progress type thing from a journal called AI Impacts. And this sort of fits very nicely with Carl, who was in the other day talking to us about AI. Mm-hmm. This is an article which is freely available on the internet called Thousands of AI Authors on the Future of AI. Which is very interesting. It's a massive article. It's a huge stack of pages. So I'm going to excerpt the most interesting bits. So what these people have done, there are 6 authors on this paper, and they've carried out a survey, the largest survey of its kind, they say, in which they surveyed 2,778 researchers, all of whom had published in top-tier artificial intelligence venues, by which I think they mean sort of journals in the widest sense. Mm-hmm. So this is not, your average person on the street. This is actual AI experts who they have surveyed, nearly 3,000 of them, about what they think is going to happen with AI.
Okay.
So some of the headlines, I have a nasty feeling we might end up not discussing this, perhaps. It's always nice when we can have a little bit of a discussion after these things. There might just be a sort of silence after this, I think.
Okay.
But trying to come back with something.
End of days stuff.
Well, first of all, they said they think that generally speaking, mashing together all of these survey responses, they felt that the chance of unaided machines outperforming humans in every possible task was estimated at being 10%. So 10% chance they could do that. I know it's numbers again, isn't it? But stick with me. 10% chance that AI, basically, unaided, will outperform humans by 2027.
What?
And there will be a 50% chance that unaided machines will outperform us in every possible task by 2047. So by 2047...
The thing I can't get my head around is 10% of
they think there's a 10% chance it'll happen.
Okay.
Or by 5 years' time, 3 years' time. I apologise, my number's going wrong. So in 3 years' time, they'll be able to outperform us. They think there's a 10% chance of that. They think that by 2047, so what's that, 23 years' time?
Yeah. 50.
There's a coin toss as to whether machines will be able to outperform humans in every possible task. So that was
even teaching.
Well, yes. I mean, actually, they have got. I mean, this was not something I had thought to bring. I'm just looking. They've got a list of jobs here.
Okay.
What they think the chances are. I don't think teaching is in there. Actually, looking at it, they've got playing Angry Birds. They've got folding laundry. They've got right near the sort of. Yeah, they've got things like translating speech and stuff like that, which is pretty quick. So that was quite interesting. If you dig into the detail, and I'm not going to do loads of these because, like I said, it's an absolutely massive thing, this paper. I think this was a scary one. Section 3.8. Will AI in 2028, so in 4 years' time, will AI truthfully and intelligibly explain its decisions? And most respondents considered it unlikely that users of AI systems in 4 years' time will be able to know the true reasons for the AI system's choices.
So it's likely, it's high, 50% chance in how many years did you say?
4.
4.
No, 50% in about 23 years that they'll outperform us, yeah.
But also that we
will not
understand why
they're doing things.
So basically they're going to take us over, aren't they?
Well,
I say they, like they're a thing. And we talked about this, didn't we, with Carl, that we shouldn't humanise AI.
I mean, they think about 80% of these AI experts felt that it was at least even likelihood. So in other words, there were only 20% of people who thought it was unlikely. Only a fifth of them felt there was a chance that we would understand the reasons behind decisions that AI systems were making in 4 years' time, that they would be doing these things. The question they asked was, will it be possible for users to know the true reasons for them making a particular choice? By which we mean that the AI correctly explains its internal decision-making process in a way humans can understand. Which is pretty scary, isn't it?
I mean, just the word internal, of what they're drawing upon existing data. That's essentially what they're doing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, they're saying that it says in the abstract, they think it's quite likely that AI will be able to autonomously create its own large language model fairly shortly. So AI creating its own AI.
Yeah, I mean, this is terrifying stuff, I think. This is why, you do see headlines of these experts saying we really need to start thinking about what we're doing and putting the brakes on certain projects because otherwise we're in a sci-fi novel, aren't we?
Well, we are. I mean, section 4.3, I like this. This is my last one now. They wanted to further clarify views on what they call extremely bad, e.g. human extinction scenarios. Extremely bad. And they were really careful about this because they asked the question in different ways to different people so they could try and triangulate a little bit. So they asked slightly different variations of the question just to check that they weren't asking a question that was skewing things. They say, depending on how we asked, I'm going to say around half, just under half to half of respondents felt there was a greater than 10% chance of human extinction or severe disempowerment.
By when?
Good question. I don't know if they put a time scale on it.
Ever. Is it possible?
I think they were really just sort of, worried about ever really on this one.
I am not happy with that percentage.
No, I think about half of them felt there was a 10% chance. 38%. Yeah, extremely bad outcomes. And the scariest thing is they did this survey a year ago, and all of these figures were lower. So in other words, they've sort of accelerated a lot of these things that I've been talking about in this. In the last year, things are moving faster than they felt they would be when they asked them these questions a year ago. And I mean, this point you're making about kind of putting the brakes on things, I think the thing that really frightens me is less kind of the potential for stuff going horribly wrong and more when you look at who's actually in charge of some of these things.
Yes.
Slightly interesting, mostly male, rather odd characters who, quite frankly, I wouldn't trust as far as I could throw them when it came to making the right choices, mostly because there's large amounts of money involved.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me want to just throw all of my devices away.
Yes.
Quite frankly. Oh my goodness! Great find, Tom.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it's a long old thing. That there's a researcher out there. I can't remember his name now. Annoyingly, I should have prepped it. Who's written an op-ed in, I think it was Time magazine quite a few years ago now, actually, suggesting that we ought to have nuclear weapons pointing at data centers housing these things.
Wow,
which is quite an interesting one.
Wow.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, you were right. So having crunched and analysed and all that survey data, did it make recommendations?
Not particularly, no. I don't think they were in for recommendations. I mean, they did ask them questions like, do you think we should be prioritising AI safety research more than it currently is? 70% of respondents said yes. Interestingly, 30% said no, which is interesting.
And what was it about? Did you say about 2,000
It was
respondents?
2,773, I think, yeah.
All experts.
All have published effectively in top-tier AI journals, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so they should know.
Sobering
stuff. So don't worry about the pedagogy of professional decline, Emma.
No.
Just worry about decline.
Yeah. What do they call it? E.g. world ending.
Yes, extremely bad, e.g. human extinction.
Human extinction.
So that's the brilliantly titled "Thousands of AI Authors on the Future of AI." That's an unusually descriptive journal article title.
Where did you find it, out of curiosity?
I found it linked.
You said it's not published yet, but...
No, it's a preprint, but it is open source online if you want to have a read of it. It was linked from another article I was reading about some of this stuff, and it led me to this one, which I thought I would bring to cheer you up.
Wow. See, doubt everything. How do you know that AI didn't write it?
Wow, how do you know that we, in fact, are not AI? I forgot to book the studio. That's my get out. AI would have booked the studio.
Oh,
You're
gosh.
safe for now.
That thing is happening, listeners, that happens in these light episodes. Things are starting to get a little bit surreal.
End of term. Yep. There we go.
Okay. I mean, I find this one a tough act to follow now.
Wow.
I feel like this is not going to
Hardly
quite...
worth reading it, really. We should just give up now.
All right. Well, this is my final offering.
Okay.
And this is my sort of in air quotation marks story. But in actual fact, it's from a podcast. So I think I recommended this podcast in a previous light episode. It's written and presented by John Ronson, British and American journalist, originally from Cardiff. He went to Cardiff High School,
know that.
FYI. Yeah.
Well.
Listen to his Desert Island Discs. He has a podcast called Things Fell Apart, and it's in its second season now. And what it aims to do as a podcast more generally is to expose the sort of strange origins and stories of the culture wars that have sort of historically divided us so toxically for decades. But season 2, he's quite clever with these episodes. So what he's exposing are new divisions which blew up within weeks of each other during the first lockdown of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, that was a time when we grew sort of ever more suspicious of our neighbours, our institutions, and what each episode does is it deals with an untruth. It tries to identify where that untruth came from, and then it looks at the ripple effects of it and how it sort of came to a head during the COVID-19 pandemic and all the sort of devastation that happened as a result of it. And the first episode, I'm not going to give away too many spoilers from it because you need to listen to it in its entirety, but it's entitled The Most Mysterious Deaths. It deals with the origins of an untruth which reared its head again during the murder of George Floyd. And the story starts in Miami in the 1980s. During that decade, you may not know, I certainly didn't, that 32 black female sex workers were found dead in alleyways and junkyards. And it was all very strange and sadly not very well covered by the media because they were female sex workers. But the sparse coverage that did come out showed that the police were really perplexed because they couldn't determine the cause of death for these poor women. And they'd all been found in sort of similar positions and basically what happened was a Dr. Wetley, who was the then chief medical examiner for Dade County, Florida, coined a term based on his sort of work on an examination of these poor women. He coined this term to describe what he felt was the cause of death, which is something called excited delirium. Now, listeners might have heard that term, and this is what's incredibly concerning about it, is that actually it was debunked in the 1980s because a further, sadly, female death occurred. And the thing that Dr. Wetley sort of found was that The cause of death through excited delirium was because of a combination of sex and drug use. They found cocaine in the 32 female sex workers' bodies. However, a further death bucked the trend because no drugs was found in the system of this poor soul, this young black female. And what was found to be the cause of death was asphyxiation. So these effectively were found to be homicides. So it was debunked way back then. However, Dr. Wheatley continued to present his theories at conferences, and they interviewed someone else on the podcast who just recently was at a conference trying to again debunk excited delirium, and I think it was to coroners, and you know there was still sort of this indelible belief that this was a thing, that this had sort of medical gravitas and was quite a robust theory. So he was presenting at those conferences, you know, purporting that this was a real theory. No one at those conferences, because in the 1980s, obviously, you know, the internet wasn't sort of proliferating these sorts of theories at the rate at which they would now. And no one at those conferences knew about the scandal in Miami. So Wheatley presented a corresponding theory then of male deaths from excited delirium. And if you Google excited delirium and you look at Wikipedia, it does state that it can be known also as agitated delirium or hyperactive delirium syndrome with severe agitation. And it says it's a controversial and widely rejected diagnosis characterised as a potentially fatal state of extreme agitation and delirium. It has typically been diagnosed post-mortem in young adult black males who were physically restrained by law enforcement personnel at the time of death. And what this podcast does incredibly well is that it exposes the ripple effect. And this one I found to be particularly horrifying. And I'm going to play you a little extract of the podcast now. Nothing too long, not too many spoilers. Here goes.
By the way, excited delirium isn't recognised by the American Medical Association, nor the American Psychiatric Association, nor the World Health Organization, and it isn't listed in the DSM, the Manual of Mental Disorders. It really should have gone the way of discredited junk sciences like phrenology, but instead it's flourished, especially in the law enforcement world. Julia, the civil rights attorney, says this is mainly for one reason: lobbying by Taser International.
After Dr. Wheatley promoted excited delirium as a potential cause of death, one of his colleagues, Dr. Vincent DeMaio, and Dr. DeMaio's wife, Teresa, wrote a book. It was published in 2006 called Excited Delirium Syndrome. By 2007, Taser International had purchased 1,000 to 1,500 copies of that book to hand out for free at forensic pathology conferences to forensic pathologists.
Given that there are only about 750 full-time forensic pathologists in the United States, Taser, now known as Axon, had purchased enough copies to cover the entire community twice over. It was obviously beneficial for Taser to promote a book that presented excited delirium as a cause of death, because it would allow them to argue that if a suspect died after being tased, there may be another explanation.
They'll smash out windows, they'll run through traffic. These people are acting bizarrely, and this is a medical emergency.
That's Dr. Wheatley's colleague, Vincent DeMaio, who co-wrote the book that Taser distributed.
They describe as having superhuman strength. You can taser them, you can hit them, and it doesn't seem to bother them. They still keep going. The police have to restrain them because they're a danger not only to others, but a danger to themselves. They'll go running through traffic.
Like Dr. DeMaio, Dr. Wheatley acted as a paid court expert for Taser many times when a taser was used on someone who subsequently died.
They know when they hire him what he's going to say. He's always going to say the taser had no role in a person's death.
And do they know that he's going to say, actually, they died as a result of excited delirium?
Yes. I mean, he's the father of excited delirium. So, yeah, they know exactly what they're buying. All taser needs is a plausible non-taser explanation for the person's death. And they knew when Dr. Whetley was alive that he would give that to them. Dr. Whetley testified, I think he said he wouldn't be surprised if he'd been retained in 100 excited delirium cases. I don't know how many of those cases were taser specific. I'll say, just having done this for 28 years, when people encounter law enforcement in the United States, if they're tased, very often they're not just tased. They're tased and restrained and beaten, very frequently by multiple officers. So I don't think that we can really know how many of his cases would have been solely taser cases without any kind of manhandling involved.
Actually, according to Reuters, it happened 276 times between 2000 and 2017. On 276 occasions, a person died after being tased, and excited delirium was listed as a cause of death. Taser told us that they defer to scientists on whether excited delirium is medically recognised, and that their weapons are the safest use of force available to law enforcement, with nearly 4 million uses over 25 years.
Murky stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things I was thinking there, one of which was all that talk of the delirium thing when you were talking to me about the female sex workers. It made me think, oh, would they be saying things like, excited delirium if they were not women? It made me think of all the kind of hysteria, sort of Victorian hysteria thing. And then what kind of sad inevitability that when they did turn out to be men, they were sort of pinning it on, they were black men. It's kind of, yeah. And also the other thing I was thinking is just occasionally in this world of academia, you get a bit tired of all the sort of knocking down of your work. We do work, we publish it, we get reviewed. Sometimes the reviewers are extremely rude. But actually you can see why we need it, why we have to be, kicking the tires of academic stuff, because you can end up in a position of enormous power if you come up with some wild idea and people haven't kicked the tires of it sufficiently.
Absolutely. I mean, this found its way into the equivalent of professional learning for the police force. They found evidence of slides with excited delirium and what to look out for, and I'm not going to give away any more. Listen to the full episode, but it is... I stood in a field and I think I rang you because I was so shocked at what I was hearing. But it did get me thinking, and obviously I'm not making a comparison here, but there are some quite pervasive, indelible theories out there of learning that are very difficult to debunk or to make stick, the fact that they have been debunked, such as VAC or VARC.
Yeah. Well, this is why, going back to your previous one, the whole pedagogy of professional decline thing and what you're saying there about the professional learning of police, we have a policing degree going on here and under this roof. And, some people probably, randoms out on the street, probably think, well, what do you need a degree for? All this kind of thing. And with teachers, this sense of, well, why is it such a terrible thing if multi-academies are just sort of pre-packaging stuff and putting it in front? I mean, obviously that's a really extreme example of what goes wrong when people don't critique stuff, but it's also a great sort of hard-hitting reason of why you do need to be critiquing stuff.
Yes.
As a practitioner now, not just the kind of point I was making about the academic sort of reviewing and peer reviewing and, arguing the toss over things, but actually as a practitioner, as a user, you should use it critically.
Yes.
And made me think also about there's been some really notorious academics who've ended up as expert witnesses and just doing a lot of damage. Roy Meadow with cot death and Andrew Wakefield with MMR. And like you were saying there, I mean, both of those two have been massively discredited, and yet their stuff refuses to die.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that expert that they had in I can't remember what she was. I'm terrible at remembering the important details. she's the one who went along to a conference just recently, the one that she delivered to coroners. And like I said, she was her mission in life, because she dealt with the fallout around the case of the individual girl that bucked the trend in the 1980s. And so she sort of made it her life's work to, continue to address those misconceptions around the use of that term. But she's, even to this day, she's doing that work.
Yeah, and it makes me also links with the AI thing, doesn't it? That where there's a big pile of money in the background, there's dodgy stuff going on. I mean, I really, really hope, not that I think it's going to happen as a teacher education academic, but I really, really hope if some money-laden massive corporation comes trying to lobby me to do something, I shall tell him where to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, listen to that series. Honestly, every episode will have you just standing wherever you are, whatever you're doing, in utter shock.
Wonderful. Right. Well, you've had a book recommendation off me. You've had a podcast recommendation off Emma. This one, we're going from human extinction to zombies now. But not in the way you might think. Okay. Although I would like to give a shout out to the authors of this paper, who have got a table towards the back, which I'm going to reference, and it's got those sort of little icons, like the design ideas you get on PowerPoints.
Yeah.
There are 4 rows, and there's a book with a magnifying glass, and one is a graph with the arrow going down. One of them, they've actually managed to get a zombie hand coming out of the ground in icon form. So well done to them for that.
It's dual coded, Tom.
It's dual coded. It's impressive attention to detail. I'm also dealing in very, very hot off the press stuff here, because this article is in press. It's not fully published. It's a sort of corrected proof. It's about to be published, so it'll be 2024, and it's in the Leadership Quarterly. Obviously, the journal of record for leaders everywhere. And I came across this again. I always come across things slightly tangentially, because I was reading quite an interesting article talking about what's called the Babel hypothesis. Have I mentioned this to you before? I may have mentioned this to you before. It's the idea that there appears to be a very strong correlation between the people who end up in leadership positions in an organisation and the people who do all the talking in meetings. Right. That basically, if you talk a lot, doesn't matter whether the quality of what you're saying is high, it's all about the quantity. You are far more likely to end up as a leader, which is quite interesting. And this paper was trying to work out whether it was correlation or whether there was actually causation going on there.
And did they?
Don't know. They seem to think there was. Some of the people commenting on it felt that it really wasn't quite robust enough. I mean, they were making the point in the paper, it's actually very hard to design a robust study that really, really kind of isolates that. So you don't just end up with a correlation. But I was thinking about it, in your gut, you sort of feel it might be true. You just talk a lot, dominate the discussion, and you're going to end up getting noticed.
Yes.
But anyway, I was going to bring that one, but actually it led me to a slightly different one. And I felt, I often feel that we slightly shortchange the leadership end of education on this fine podcast. We've had 1 or 2 educational leaders on. We've both been slightly snarky about educational leaders on occasion.
Yes.
Me especially.
No,
I may
agree.
have used the word desk jockeys earlier. And so as my penance, my final article is about leadership.
Okay.
And the title of it is Zombie Leadership, Dead Ideas That Still Walk Among Us. So I thought this might be potentially useful for anyone who's kind of looking into these things. The whole point of the article is the idea that there are ideas about leadership, and I can't really put it better than they do. Zombie leadership ideas. So ideas that refuse to die, a bit like your things you were talking about a minute ago, but in the leadership world. They live on not because they have empirical support, but because they flatter and appeal to elites, to the leadership industrial complex that supports them, and also to the anxieties of ordinary people in a world seemingly beyond their control. And so the authors do us a public service by identifying 8 ideas about leadership, which they basically say are the terrible ideas that refuse to die
Okay.
of the world of leadership. So I thought I would read them out. Number 1, leadership is all about leaders. So in other words, it shouldn't be that. It's proved by followership and requires us to study and understand the people who are following. Mm-hmm. So, it's not all about you as the leader. Incidentally, I was quite gratified to see the illustrative headline to illustrate that zombie idea was "The Man Who Saved a BBC Orchestra" from Norman Le Brecht's blog. He's a very very snarky music critic. He does run a very, very good sort of slightly underground news blog, but he was extremely rude about me once. So quite pleased to see
open
him.
fire then.
Absolutely. He let rip at something I wrote for the conversation, and lots of rude comments about me ensued. So I'm quite pleased to see old Norman Le Brecht there being used as an illustrative headline for a zombie leadership axiom. Number 2, there are specific qualities that all great leaders have. Another myth. Mm-hmm. There are specific things that all great leaders do. We all know a great leader when we see one. All leadership is the same. That there is an essential leadershipness that can be discerned across all contexts. That leadership is a special skill limited to special people. You can see why they're saying that these are attractive to people in leadership roles. Leadership is always good, and it is always good for everyone. And finally, people can't cope without leaders. In fact, there's a hilarious thing that often happens in orchestral rehearsals where the conductor will say, I'm not going to conduct for a minute. I would like you to do this bit without me conducting. And then it's always a really bad idea if you're the conductor, because the orchestra inevitably plays better when they stop conducting than when they're there. It's always a really, really bad thing to do.
That's interesting. Is that because they're more in tune with each other?
Yes.
If they're not paying attention to one overall leader.
Yeah, they're listening properly, usually. I mean, orchestra didn't really have conductors for a long, long time. They're quite a recent innovation. Person at the front waving a stick. You don't want to get orchestral players started on conductors, but yeah, it's quite an interesting one that they then listen to each other. So they make some suggestions for strategies for defeating zombie leadership. It's all in a very nice table, which includes a very nicely drawn icon of a zombie hand punching through the earth. First of all, recognise the components of zombie leadership meta theory. So in other words, know that these things are complete rubbish. Mm-hmm. And they give 4 little points there. Only leaders can lead. Leaders have qualities that set them apart from ordinary people. Group success should be attributed to leaders. History is ultimately the story of great leaders. So, the toxic myths of leadership. Return to the definition of leadership. And I like this one. 4 key points about this. Lovely one for teachers at all levels here. Leadership is grounded in relationships and connections. Without some form of followership, there can be no leadership. Leadership is more about getting people to want to do things than about making them do them. Leadership is a group process and ultimately about the activities of collectives, not just individuals.
That's definitely, I mean, you start out as a leader in your own classroom, don't you? So how you work with pupils there is quite, it's important.
Yeah, they say then recognise the cost of zombie leadership, fails to recognise and reward the efforts and achievements of ordinary people, alienates group members, damages leaders by inducing narcissism, complacency and unwillingness to listen, reduces the productivity and health of groups and society, and then suggests championing theoretical and practical alternative to zombie leadership. So there's some really nice ideas for our glorious overlords. Not our glorious overlords, glorious overlords in general.
I mean, you must remember, Tom, that we're both programme leaders.
We are programme leaders, yes, we are. But, I think, teachers in general are leaders, aren't they? I mean, we're all leaders. But there's some really good things to think there, because we had that thing I did in the Christmas special, didn't we? About it's not all about you.
Yeah.
I think it's quite nice to have an occasional little thing that just goes, it's not all about you.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there are different types of teacher out there. Like, that thing you said about the Babel theory is really important to note, because there are a lot of teachers out there who would probably characterise themselves as introverts. Some of the best teachers, that you've probably seen, but are quite introverted, and perhaps might be even more so in I don't know, departmental meetings and might sort of sit quietly thinking, but have really important contributions to make, but, not dominating the conversation. So, yeah, I think that's a really important, hopefully that gets to full publication. That seems like a really great article.
Yeah, I mean, we've said it before, haven't we, that there is a weird thing in schools in particular where you get promoted into a senior leadership role from the classroom, and the amount of sort of actual leadership stuff you get. I mean, I don't know, maybe this is only in the contexts that I've worked, but there was a sense that you sort of got plucked from the classroom and put in charge of people and line managing people and doing stuff like that. And I didn't get a sense that people were given an enormous amount. I mean, obviously you've got the NPQH for head teachers and deputy head teachers, but you definitely sort of got yourself just thrown into it. And I always felt as a sort of, proud worker at the chalk face that I wouldn't want a leader that hadn't done their time in the classroom. But the longer I did it, the more I wondered whether I was, in fact, wrong about that. I don't know.
I don't know. The jury's out.
Yeah, it was nice to see that there is an academic journal about leadership.
Yes, great title.
The Leadership Quarterly and Zombie Leadership.
That's going to grab them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's good. So yes, overlords, not just ours, but overlords in general, can enjoy that article.
Again, you're referring to us right there.
Yeah, I tend not to think of myself as a leadery type. I am that person who will say nothing in a meeting and, keep stum and just get on with it. But there we are. That's just me.
Good stuff.
Yeah, varied.
It wasn't a light one.
No, sorry, readers. That was a bit wholesome and heavy, wasn't it? Particularly the human extinction, extremely bad scenarios bit.
Yeah, please don't panic.
No.
Yeah.
There we are.
We've sort of like petered out now, haven't we?
We've
done our homework, we've done our bit, and now we're spent. We're going to leave you to your confectionery, to your chocolate eggs if you are partaking in that. Just to the rest of your holiday period,
yes.
Really.
Normal service, thank goodness, in 2 weeks' time if we're still here. You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. We hope you're getting some much-needed downtime in your Easter break, and thanks to all the people whose stuff we shamelessly pinched for this special episode. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blandford, and the music is by Cameron Stewart. We're on X at Talk Teaching Pod if you want to come and say hello. We'll be back in a fortnight, human extinction permitting, with something else interesting. Until then, take care and enjoy teaching.